There was a time when food came with something we didn't have a name for. Not calories, not nutrients, not vitamins listed on a box. Something else. You could taste it in bread that sat on the counter for 3 days and still smelled like wheat. You could feel it in milk that separated if you left it alone. You could see it in apples that turned brown within minutes of being cut. Food used to do things. It changed, it responded, it lived even after it was picked or poured or baked. And then, slowly, it stopped. Not all at once, not with an announcement, but if you compare what people ate in 1920 to what filled the shelves by 1980, something fundamental had been removed. Not just from the food itself, but from the relationship between the body and what it recognized as nourishment. This is not about what was added. This is about what was taken away. By the mid-20th century, food science had discovered something powerful. You could extend the life of food almost indefinitely if you removed the parts that spoiled. Wheat berries contain a germ and a bran. The germ is rich in oils, vitamins, minerals. The bran holds fiber. But both of these components go rancid. They attract insects. They shorten shelf life. So they were removed. White flour became the standard. It could sit in a warehouse for months, shipped across continents, stored in homes without refrigeration. It didn't spoil because there was almost nothing left in it that could. The same logic applied to rice. Brown rice contains the bran and the germ. White rice is what remains after those layers are stripped away. It lasts longer. It cooks faster. It became cheaper to produce and easier to distribute. Oils followed the same path. Cold-pressed oils from olives, seeds, and nuts would spoil within weeks, so manufacturers began refining them, heating, bleaching, deodorizing, until what remained was a clear, stable liquid that could sit on a shelf for years. Sugar was concentrated and separated from the fibrous plants it came from. Juice was pasteurized and stripped of pulp. Milk was homogenized so the cream would never rise. Butter was replaced with margarine, which didn't need to be kept cold. These were not presented as losses. They were presented as progress. Convenience, consistency, safety, affordability. And for decades, no one questioned what had been left behind in the process. What was removed from food was not always listed on a label. The bran and germ of wheat contain B vitamins, magnesium, zinc, iron, and dozens of phytonutrients that don't have names yet. Fiber that slows digestion, oils that satisfy hunger. When white flour replaced whole grain, these were gone. Some were added back, enriched flour, fortified cereals, but the replacement was selective. 4 or 5 synthetic vitamins in place of 40 naturally occurring compounds. It was enough to prevent deficiency diseases like beriberi and pellagra, but it wasn't the same thing the body had evolved to recognize over millennia. In oils, the refining process didn't just remove impurities, it removed fat-soluble vitamins. It altered the structure of fatty acids. Cold-pressed olive oil contains polyphenols, compounds that reduce inflammation, support cardiovascular function, protect cells from oxidative damage. Refined oils do not. The same was true for sugar. Whole sugarcane contains molasses, which holds trace minerals, potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron. When sugar is refined into white crystals, those are removed. What remains is pure sucrose. The body processes it differently. The liver responds differently. The pancreas works harder. Juice was pasteurized to kill bacteria, but heat also destroyed vitamin C and enzymes that aid digestion. Pulp, which contains fiber and slows the absorption of sugar, was filtered out. What remained was fructose in liquid form, consumed faster than any fruit could be eaten whole. Milk was homogenized, breaking apart fat globules so they wouldn't separate, but that process also altered the way the body digests those fats. Proteins were denatured, enzymes were inactivated. Raw milk, which had been consumed for thousands of years, was replaced with something more uniform, but also more distant from what the body had adapted to. And then there were the animals. Livestock that once grazed on pasture were moved indoors, fed grain instead of grass. The fat composition of their meat changed. Grass-fed beef contains higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid, and vitamins A and E. Grain-fed beef does not. The chickens that laid eggs on open ground produced yolks rich in vitamin D. When moved to indoor operations and fed grain, the nutrient profile shifted. It wasn't that the food became poison, it was that the food became something else, something the body no longer fully recognized. For the first few decades, it seemed fine. No one got sick immediately from white bread. No one collapsed after drinking pasteurized milk. The changes were invisible at first, incremental, spanning generations. But the body kept track. Rates of tooth decay, which had been relatively stable for centuries, began to climb in the early 1900s. Dentists like Weston A. Price traveled the world in the 1930s, comparing isolated populations eating traditional diets to those consuming modern processed foods. The differences were stark. Indigenous groups eating whole foods had wide dental arches, straight teeth, almost no cavities. Within a single generation of adopting refined flour, sugar, and canned goods, their children developed crowded teeth, narrow jaws, rampant decay. Something structural had changed. By the 1950s, heart disease had become the leading cause of death in the United States. It had been rare at the turn of the century. Researchers pointed to saturated fat and cholesterol, but others noted the timeline. The rise in heart disease coincided almost exactly with the widespread adoption of refined oils, margarine, and hydrogenated fats. Diabetes, once uncommon, began to climb in the 1960s and accelerated sharply in the 1980s. Type 2 diabetes, previously called adult onset, began appearing in children. The common explanation was overeating and inactivity, but those factors had existed before. What had changed was the food itself, the removal of fiber, the concentration of sugar, the elimination of fats that slowed absorption. Digestive disorders, once considered rare, became routine. Irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, celiac disease. Conditions that had been nearly absent from medical literature in the early 20th century began appearing with increasing frequency. Autoimmune diseases followed a similar pattern. Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, all rose in prevalence. Some researchers began to suspect that the immune system was reacting not to food itself, but to the altered structure of food, to proteins that had been denatured, to fibers that had been removed, to oils that had been chemically changed. And then there was the appetite. People began to eat more. Not because they were greedier, but because their bodies were no longer satisfied. Refined carbohydrates entered the bloodstream quickly, spiked insulin, and left the body hungry again within hours. Fiber, which once slowed digestion and signaled fullness, was gone. Fats, which once provided satiety, were removed or replaced with versions the body didn't recognize. The result was a population that ate more and felt less nourished. Obesity, which had been virtually unknown in the early 1900s, became common by the 1980s and epidemic by the 2000s. It wasn't a failure of willpower, it was a mismatch between what the body expected and what it was given. Children born in the 1990s were the first generation predicted to have a shorter lifespan than their parents. Not because of war or famine, but because of abundance. Abundance of food that had been stripped of the components that once made it food. There was no single moment when it happened. No meeting where someone decided to remove the germ from wheat or refine sugar into white crystals. No announcement that fiber would be filtered out or oils would be chemically altered. It happened across decades, across industries, across continents. Each change, taken alone, seemed reasonable, practical, a solution to a problem of spoilage or cost or scale. But together, they created something new. A food system built not around nourishment, but around shelf life. Not around what the body needed, but what could be produced, stored, and sold. And for a long time, no one noticed. Because the body is patient. It adapts. It compensates. It survives on less for years, sometimes decades, before the consequences become visible. But eventually, they do. In teeth that decay, in hearts that fail, in blood sugar that swings, in appetites that are never truly satisfied. The question isn't whether this was intentional. The question is whether we ever stopped to ask what was lost. Not what was added, preservatives, emulsifiers, synthetic vitamins, but the parts of food that didn't have names yet, the compounds that didn't make it onto nutrition labels, the relationships between fiber and sugar, between fat and vitamins, between the soil and the seed, the things that made food more than the sum of its nutrients. It's easy to think of food as fuel, calories in, calories out, protein, fat, carbohydrate. But the body doesn't experience food that way. It experiences it as a language, a set of signals it has learned to interpret over millennia. And somewhere along the way, we stopped speaking that language fluently. We gave the body sentences with the verbs removed, paragraphs with the context stripped away, and wondered why it stopped understanding. This is not about going backward. It's about recognizing that something was taken, quietly, methodically, and that the effects of that removal are still unfolding. This was one kind of removal, but it was not the only one.